Hey everyone, today we're going to go through how I made this baby in bloom baby shower cake. This was for my son and my daughter-in-law's baby shower. They have a baby girl that will be born at the time of recording this in probably another 3 or 4 weeks. So I thought I would show you how I made the cake. So to get started, you're just going to take some fondant and I'm using a baby mold here, a baby fondant mold, and I will put links in the description for everything that I used, or I'll try to get most things in there for you. But just take some fondant and tint the fondant a little bit for the flesh color that you need. And then you're just going to add it to the fondant mold and push it in there, really get it in there. And I'm just using a little brush with some cornstarch so everything doesn't get too sticky. And then I just kind of take a palette knife and shave off the top, push it down in there. And now what you're going to do is put this in the freezer for, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes or so. You want it to harden up so you can actually get it out of the mold. So after 5 or 10 minutes, you want to take it out of the mold. Just kind of pull the mold apart and the baby will come right out. And now you want to be very careful here not to touch it because it's going to get condensation all over it because it's been in the freezer. So don't touch it and let it sit to the side until it completely dries and hardens up, maybe a day or so. So now I'm just taking some petal dust, some edible petal dust, and I'm adding a little bit more color to the baby. And I also made several of these. I never like to just depend on one of them because it's inevitable that something will break. So I always like to have backups. But just use some petal dust to add a little bit of dimension to the skin of the baby. And also like to add a little bit of pink to the cheeks and a little bit of pink to the skin. And I will put a link to a tutorial video that I watched to help me do this. It was from McGreevy Cakes, and I'll put a link to that YouTube video in the description. And so for the hair, I didn't have any brown petal dust, so I just used cocoa powder, which sort of worked in a pinch. It was probably a little bit more red than I wanted, but I think it worked out. And then I just dusted off everything. And for the little tutu, I just sort of cut strips of fondant and added it to the baby. And then I used a fondant rose mold to mold a couple of little pink roses and stuck them to the little tutu that she has on. And I made several different ones. Like here you can see I've added a bow, a fondant bow to her hair, and there were just several different ones or options that I made, and so that I could kind of pick out which one I liked the best. So here's one, and then here's another one that I made the little tutu a little bit differently, but you can just kind of design it however you like. So for the petals that the baby is going to be sitting on or laying on, I just took it's like a biscuit cutter here, 2 different sizes, and rolled out the fondant pretty thin and cut out several of those circles. And then I just took my ball roller and I thinned out the edges and made them a little bit ruffly, and I'm just using a firm foam mat to do that. And so once I did that, I added a little bit of water to the circles and then added the smaller round circle on top of it, and then popped in some little paper towel balls in there to kind of keep them up so they'll dry like that. You want to set those to the side and let them dry. And then at the end, you just pop the baby right on the top. And like I said, I always make extras. So to make the cake, it was a 2-tier cake. The top tier was 8 inches and the bottom tier was 10 inches. The top tier was lemon, bottom tier was strawberry. So here you can see I'm working with the lemon cake, which was the 8-inch tier. And I always like to use 3 layers to make 1 tier because it kind of makes a little bit of a taller cake that's not so squatty. You know, back in the 80s, we used to do like 2 layers per tier, and it would kind of make for like a squatty cake. So I like 3 layers per tier. So I'm just building it, and I'm just going to put a really light thin coat around it, and then I like to cover it with plastic wrap. So what I'm going to do is let it sit like this so that it can settle, because I want all of that filling to squish out however much it's going to go ahead and squish out. I don't want to decorate it now because when it settles later, it's going to have ridges around the cake. So I like to let it settle ahead of time. So I'm covering it with plastic wrap. I'm going to set it to the side, not in the fridge because I don't have anything perishable on this. I'm going to set it to the side so it can settle for at least a couple hours, maybe even overnight, depending on what your timeline is. All right, so I'm going to work on the 10-inch bottom tier, and this is the strawberry cake. And by the way, I will put a link to the recipes that I used. They're on my website. You can go there and print them out. You can even change the ingredients to metric measurements if you need that. But anyway, I'll put a link to all that in the description. So again, I'm going with 3 layers for this bottom tier, and I'm just adding the buttercream, which I will also link the recipe to in the description. And by the way, you do not have to use my method of doing this. Everybody kind of does what is best for them. And this is just how I like to do this. This helps me not get those icing ridges around the cake or icing blowouts. So, but whatever works for you, you go ahead and do that. So here I'm just adding like a really thin, I guess you could call it a crumb coat. I don't even know if it's thick enough to call a crumb coat. I just want to seal it in so it doesn't dry out. And then I'm covering it here with plastic wrap again because I'm going to set it to the side for at least a few hours to let it settle. And I'll show you in just a minute what that looks like once the cake has settled. Oh, and by the way, I let it settle at room temperature as long as it's not like a cake that has fruit or anything perishable like whipped cream frosting or something like that. All right, so here you're going to see the lemon cake, the top tier has settled. I've let it settle for a couple of hours. You can see here the ridges where the filling squished out a little bit. Now, had I gone ahead and decorated it fully, you would see these ridges on the fully decorated cake because it would squish out. I don't want that to happen. So I want it to go ahead and settle first. Then I'm going to do the final decorating on it. So now I'm just going to take my spatula, dig into those sort of squished out filling lines, and dig out some of that frosting. And this next part is the part that is a little different than you might see other people decorating cakes. I don't know, it depends on who you watch, I guess. But this is just the way that I do it because I cannot get straight up and down sides to my cake just freehanding it. So I have to have a guide. So I'm going to add some frosting to the very top of my cake, and I'm going to also put a cake board on top of that. And it's the same size cake board as the bottom cake board, which is 8 inches because that's what that top tier is 8 inches. So now I'm just using a level because I want it to be straight up and down because I'm going to use the top and the bottom board as my guide to help me get those straight sides. So as you can see, it doesn't have to be like super perfect, but you just want it to be level, and you level the top as well. And so once the top is level, I'm going to pop this in the fridge, but only for maybe 10 minutes, not too long, or you're going to cause condensation, just maybe just 10 minutes or so. That gets that top board firm on there. Now what I'm doing is I'm cutting off a little bit of the cake, and that is because when I use my scraper to add the icing and I use the top and bottom board as my guide, if the cake is really close to the edge of the board, it's going to show through. I'm not going to be able to get enough icing on there. The cake's going to show through the icing, and this isn't one of those semi-naked cakes. It's actually going to be decorated with a good amount of buttercream. So I'm trimming off a little bit of the cake so that it doesn't show through the icing when I ice around the cake. And I flipped it over so I could do the other end of it as well because it's kind of hard to get up at the top. And you'll see that a little bit better in the strawberry cake I do next. But yeah, I just trim a little bit off. Please don't come for me about this. If you don't like this kind of method that I'm using here and you have a better method, you go ahead and use that. It's completely okay. But each of us kind of does whatever works best for each of us. And I'm just making sure that the top board is level before I start adding any more frosting to it. I want everything to be level. So now I'm just going to take my buttercream and add it all around the cake, and I just kind of hold that top board there while I add everything. And if you're still confused why I add the top board to it, you'll see here in just a minute why I do that. And here we go. I'm going to use my icing scraper or my buttercream scraper. Use any one you like. Some people like the metal ones better. I like this one because it's really tall. But see how it gets the sides straight up and down? I'm not angling in or out, and I just can't do it free-handed. So now what I'm going to do is pop it in the fridge only for about 10 minutes or so. Not very long, because you don't want condensation to really form on it. You just want it to set just a little bit. So I'm going to do the same thing with this bottom tier, which is the strawberry cake. I'm just adding a top board that is 10 inches, just like the bottom board, and just using my level to make sure that it is on there level and straight so that my sides will be straight and not angled in or angled out. And you know, you can always take your level. I always cover mine with plastic wrap so that, you know, just to make sure that it's food safe. I popped it in the fridge for just about 5 or 10 minutes to make sure the top board was good and stuck on there. And now I'm just taking a knife and trimming off a little bit of the cake so it doesn't show through whenever I scrape the icing around it. So now if you don't use the top board and the bottom board method like I do, you may not have to do that because you just add the icing and use a scraper. But I can't get my sides straight up and down. Like my hand always wants to angle in or it wants to angle out, and I just want it to be symmetrical, and so this is why I use this method. Again, you don't have to use this method. I just thought I would show you how I do it and how I can get straight up and down sides. And if you want to try it, feel free to do it and let me know how you like it and if it worked out for you. I'm really curious. And another thing is it's really important to let your cakes settle so that the icing in the filling doesn't squish out later on. You want it to go ahead and do whatever it's going to do first and then do the final decorating of the cake. So those two things are the most important things in my mind, is to let the cake settle a little bit before you actually do the final decorating. Of course, you can decorate the cake however you want to after that, whether you use this method or your own method. All right, so I've got the cake all trimmed, and now I'm going to add the buttercream between the two cake boards. This is kind of one of my favorite parts. It's just kind of satisfying to sort of fill everything in with buttercream. Okay, and so I do the same thing with this one as I did with the top tier. I'm going to finish adding this coat of buttercream and smooth it, and then I'm going to pop it in the fridge, obviously for like 10 minutes or so. Then after it's been chilled for 10 minutes, you're going to take a bowl of very hot water and just use an icing spatula, and you're going to kind of stick it under that top board there and pop it off. So you just keep wiping your spatula off with the hot water and it'll pop right off. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of buttercream to the top because you want the top to be smooth. It's not going to be super smooth once you take off that top board. It kind of messes it up a little bit. And my buttercream isn't super smooth around the cake. I can see a couple little spots there, but it's going to be okay for this cake. I wasn't too picky about it because I'm going to add a texture around the cake. So I didn't work too hard to get it super flat and super straight. And then I'm just curving the edge of the cake because I don't want to have a super sharp edge to this cake since I'm going to add a texture. And then to add the texture, I took an icing spatula and just used my turntable, turned it while I used the icing spatula. I used one of the larger ones first, and then I used a smaller one to add a little bit more texture to it. All right, so then for the larger cake, for the bottom tier, I'm doing the same thing using that bowl of really super hot water and adding my icing spatula to it, going back and forth, just barely sticking it under that top tier. If you try to just pull it off, it's going to pull all of the icing off at the top of the cake. You don't want to do that. Just use your bowl of hot water and just keep sticking your spatula in it, kind of wiping it off and then sticking it under that top board, and eventually it will pop off for you. Sometimes it takes a lot of icing off with it like it just did, but it still works better using that hot water method than if you use nothing at all. So it's completely fine because you're going to have to clean up the top anyway, and you want to add a little bit more buttercream to that top and level it out. And then if you want super straight cakes or super straight buttercream, then you can just take your icing smoother and go over it once again. You can even take one of those metal icing smoothers and run some really hot water over it, dry it off, and then take it around the cake, and that will really smooth everything out. Like I said earlier, it didn't really matter to me. It didn't need to be perfect because I was going to add a texture to this cake anyway. So here I'm just smoothing the top a little bit, and then I need to smooth the corners of the cake just a bit before I add the texture. And I'm just going to do just the same that I did with the top tier and use the larger icing spatula to go around the cake as I'm turning the turntable. And then I use the smaller spatula to add a little bit more texture. Okay, now we're going to start putting everything together. You can see my bottom cake board that I have there. I just put a ribbon around it to kind of give it a little bit of decorative element there, and I'm adding in some melted candy melts. That's how I like to stick the bottom cake tier to that bottom cake base. And I'm working with a chilled cake here. I have chilled it after I added the texture to the buttercream and just using a spatula to get it in the right location. It is always easier to work with chilled buttercream cakes, especially whenever you're stacking them. You do kind of want that so you don't mess up the buttercream. And then I'm just using an 8-inch cake board that I put on the top, and I'm just kind of drawing around it with a toothpick so I know where that top tier is going to go. And now I'm going to use some plastic dowel rods, and they're hollow in the middle. One of the brands that you can use is called Poly Dowels, and then there's lots of other brands. I think Wilton has brands too that are dowels that will work that's similar. And this is an actual edible marker, and I'm just marking the very top of where the dowel meets the cake, and then I'm going to twist it and pull it out. So each dowel needs to be cut at this same height. I don't cut each one individually, like set the dowel in, cut it, set another dowel in, cut it. I want them all to be the same height so that it is completely level. So I've cut them all using a pipe cutter. That kind of works best. And then I'm just going to add all of them into the cake here. So now I just add a little bit more of buttercream to kind of cover that up. And it also helps for that top tier to really stick onto the bottom tier. So now I'm going to take the chilled top tier, because again, if it's chilled, you can kind of move it around with your hands, as you can see here, and it doesn't totally destroy the buttercream. So I'm just going to make sure that it is on there and that it is level. I'm going to set another board on the top just so I can check to make sure that it is level. And look at that. It's completely level. That's what you want to see. That is an exciting day. All right, so now I'm just going to add a buttercream border to the bottom, and I just used a round piping tip just to kind of make like a pearl border around it. It was simple. I wanted to keep everything as simple as I could. And this is something I found just for myself, that it's easier to pipe borders on cakes when they're not on a turntable, because sometimes it can kind of turn on you if it's sitting on a turntable, and that can kind of mess up your border. So I don't like to use turntables for that. I just sort of pipe a little bit of the border, turn the cake, and then just keep going. All right, so for the topper, the floral topper, what I did was take, I'm using, the top tier was an 8-inch cake, and so I used an 8-inch board and I cut it down a little bit. And I'm just kind of using the pan there as my guide, and I cut down an 8-inch cake board a little bit, because what I'm going to do is, instead of making a floral arrangement that I have to kind of push into the cake, I want to glue it on top of a cake board so that I can just set it on there, and it's not, you know, adding a lot of holes into the cake. But this is how it turned out. I think it turned out really cute, and I just kind of hot glued all of the flowers there, and I can just set this on top of the cake without having to poke a whole bunch of holes into the top. And now the ones that I actually added to the tiers, I did still use the stems, and I used floral tape to wrap around them, and then I'm going to add that stem, kind of push it into a straw, because I don't really want the stem to go directly into the cake. I wanted a barrier so that it would still remain food safe. And then I'm just piping in a little bit of buttercream inside of that straw just to form an extra barrier. And then I'm just going to push that floral arrangement inside of the cake however I want it. Sometimes you can use like some needle nose pliers. They will really help you get it into the cake. It's kind of hard to push it in if the cake is cold, so you might want to set your cake out a little bit to come to more room temperature while you push in the floral arrangements if you have those. All right, so I'm just going to add a little bit of buttercream to my cake board that I made my top floral arrangement on so that it will stick to the very top of the cake. See how much easier it is? You just plop this on the top. You do not have to worry about having to stick things into the cake, and as long as you pop it on there with a little bit of buttercream, it should stay put. And so I added the Baby in Bloom cake topper. I got this from Amazon as well, and added a little buttercream to those little petals I made earlier, and just set the little fondant baby on top And after a minute, everything will firm up and it will be ready to go. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a little bit longer than I normally do, but I wanted to give you all the details on how I made this, and hopefully it can help you in the future, whether you make a cake like this or some other cake. Maybe you got a couple of tips that you can use later on. All right, y'all, see you in the next video. Bye.